These are 29 satellites sitting on top of a rocket that has already flown 5 times before. And when they lift off from Florida on Friday morning, they join the largest satellite constellation ever assembled in human history. This is the story of what that actually means, not just for the launch, but for the rocket, the technology, and a broadband network that now serves 10 million people across 155 countries, still growing at a pace this industry has never seen. Friday, March 13th, 2026. The launch window opens at 6 a.m. Eastern and closes at 10. The rocket is a Falcon 9, lifting off from Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station on Florida's Space Coast, carrying 29 Starlink satellites to low Earth orbit. On the surface, that reads like any other SpaceX morning. Another batch of internet satellites, another routine departure from the Space Coast. And that routine quality is exactly what makes it worth paying attention to. Start with the booster flying this mission, which is on its 6th flight. That same first stage has already launched 5 previous Starlink missions, returned to Earth, been inspected, refurbished, and stocked again. And today it will attempt a precision landing on a drone ship called the Just Read the Instructions, waiting in the Atlantic Ocean. That name is not a random corporate designation. SpaceX named both of its Atlantic and Pacific drone ships after spacecraft from I.N.M. Banks' science fiction novel series, the Culture series. Just Read the Instructions and a Shortfall of Gravitas. And that detail tells you something real about the people who built this program. 6 flights, though, is nowhere near the record, and understanding where the record actually sits changes how you see all of this. On February 22nd, 2026, a SpaceX booster designated B1067 completed its 33rd flight, and that number currently stands as the world record for the most times a single orbital-class rocket booster has ever flown. 3 weeks before this launch, one rocket redefined what reuse looks like at an industrial scale. To put 33 flights in context, consider the Space Shuttle program. A single orbiter might complete 30 or more missions across entire decades of service. B1067 matched and surpassed that total in roughly 4 years, with just 75 days separating its 32nd and 33rd flights. And its origin story matters here, because that booster first flew in June 2021 on NASA's CRS-22 mission, a cargo resupply to the International Space Station, before moving on to crewed flights, commercial satellites, and dozens of dedicated Starlink missions. No rocket booster in the history of spaceflight has flown more times. As of March 10, 2026, rockets from the Falcon 9 family have launched 623 times, posting 620 full mission successes, which works out to a 99.52% success rate. 30 Falcon 9 missions have already gone up in 2026, and we are 2 weeks into March. The cadence in 2025 reached 165 orbital missions for the full year, up from just 25 launches back in 2020, a 6.5 times increase over 5 years, with 2025 also marking SpaceX's 500th rocket landing and its 500th launch of a reused booster. What reusability did to cost is where the economics of the constellation come from. Compared to traditional expendable rockets, Falcon 9 reusability cut launch costs by 70 to 80%, bringing the effective cost to orbit down to approximately $2,720 per kilogram. And that cost reduction is precisely what makes a constellation of nearly 10,000 active satellites financially possible. As of early March 2026, SpaceX has launched a total of 11,463 Starlink satellites, with 9,931 in orbit and 9,920 of those actively working. That number requires a bit of history to land properly. Since Sputnik launched in 1957, roughly 14,000 total satellites have been placed in orbit by every nation combined across nearly 7 decades of spaceflight. SpaceX now accounts for more than half of every active satellite circling this planet. Starlink represents 65% of all active satellites in orbit today, with nearly 12,000 planned for the full constellation and a possible extension to 34,400 down the line. In 2025, 120 dedicated Starlink missions deployed more than 3,000 V2 mini satellites and added approximately 270 terabits per second of network capacity in a single year, while the service delivered median download speeds around 200 megabits per second, upload speeds above 30, and median latency around 26 milliseconds globally. That latency number is worth unpacking. Traditional geostationary satellite internet, the kind that predates Starlink, produces latency of 600 milliseconds or higher because those satellites orbit at enormous altitudes. Starlink operates at roughly 550 kilometers, which compresses that round-trip signal time down to something that feels like actual broadband, rather than a delayed connection with a satellite dish on the roof. Subscriber growth followed accordingly. December 2022 brought the announcement of 1 million customers. September 2024 reached 4 million. December 2025 hit 9 million. And February 2026, last month, crossed 10 million active users. What makes those numbers striking is the pace behind them. Starlink added 4.6 million subscribers in 2025 alone, matching the total added across the previous 4 years combined. The company is now targeting more than 25 million subscribers by the end of 2026, alongside a direct-to-cell service already operating across 22 countries, with more than 6 million monthly customers on unmodified smartphones. There is one detail specific to this Friday launch that has nothing to do with business or engineering, and it is one of the stranger and more visually arresting things the Space Coast produces. Because the launch window opens at 6 a.m., the rocket may leave the ground before sunrise, and that timing, under the right atmospheric conditions, produces what observers now call a space jellyfish. Here is what actually happens. At extreme altitude, the upper stage sits in direct sunlight while observers on the ground below remain in darkness. Sunlight hits the exhaust, primarily water vapor and carbon dioxide, and as that exhaust expands into the thin upper atmosphere, it spreads into a glowing bulb-shaped cloud with wispy trailing edges, and from the ground it looks exactly like what it is named after. 8 days before this launch, on March 4th, a Falcon 9 carrying another 29 Starlink satellites lifted off from Cape Canaveral at 5:52 in the morning, and the resulting space jellyfish was photographed widely across Florida, lingering in the sky for approximately 15 to 20 minutes as the sun came up. Historically, the same phenomenon has triggered UFO reports, public panic, and in the early days of ballistic missile programs, genuine fear of nuclear strikes. Context changes what you see in the sky considerably. Any complete account of what SpaceX has built needs to include what independent observers and critics have raised as serious concerns, and the concerns are not minor. NASA's Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel put it plainly in its 2024 annual report, warning that SpaceX's launch cadence may interfere with sound judgment, deliberate analysis, and careful implementation of corrective actions. Even while the same report praised the company's openness with NASA, space journalist Eric Berger framed it differently, arguing that the driving factor behind recent anomalies is SpaceX's ever-present pressure to accelerate while simultaneously taking on more challenging tasks, and that the company may have reached a natural speed limit for commercial spaceflight. February 2025 produced a concrete example of what that pressure can look like. An upper stage malfunction after a Starlink launch prevented the stage from completing its planned deorbit burn, leaving it in orbit for 2 weeks before it fell near the city of Poznan, Poland in an uncontrolled re-entry. No injuries came from it, but the event renewed questions about debris management at the scale SpaceX now operates. Astronomers have raised separate and ongoing concerns about the brightness of Starlink satellites interfering with ground-based telescope observations, a problem that scales directly with every new spacecraft added to the constellation. And in 2026, SpaceX announced a constellation altitude change in response to growing traffic at certain orbital bands, which signals that even at 550 kilometers, orbital space is filling up. None of these concerns have interrupted the launch schedule, but they represent real, unresolved debates inside the space industry and the scientific community. 29 satellites, a 6-flight booster, a pre-dawn launch window, and a drone ship sitting in the Atlantic waiting to catch a rocket. Framed that way, Friday morning on the Space Coast sounds like any other day. But a Falcon 9 family with a 99.52% success rate across 623 flights is not any other day. A single booster with 33 flights on record is not routine. A constellation of nearly 10,000 active satellites serving 10 million customers, a customer base that doubled inside a single year, is not standard operating procedure for any industry, let alone one that was launching 25 missions annually just 5 years ago. SpaceX has industrialized access to orbit at a speed and scale that would have sounded implausible 2 decades ago. Whether that calls for admiration, scrutiny, or both depends on which layer of the story you examine, and it honestly calls for both. The altitude changes, the debris incident over Poland, the safety panel warnings, those are real, and they sit alongside the reusability records and the subscriber growth and the 165 launches in a single year. Friday morning, a Falcon 9 will leave Cape Canaveral. A booster will land on a drone ship named after a science fiction spacecraft. 29 satellites will separate and begin their path to low Earth orbit. And if the timing holds and you happen to be outside before sunrise along the Florida coast, you might catch a jellyfish glowing in the sky for 15 minutes before it fades. That is the launch. That is the story. And there will be another one next week.